My name is John Seel. I'm the author of The New Copernicans, Millennials and the Survival of the Church. And the thesis of my book is that basically almost everything said about millennials is wrong, and that they are the hope of the church. Not only do they think differently, but they think better. And until the church pays attention to the frame shift, cultural, religious frame shift that they represent, the church's survival is in jeopardy. No millennial actually wants to be called a millennial. And anybody who is my age who even uses the word millennial, the hairs on the back of the head of a millennial will immediately stand up and they'll become defensive because they have been misunderstood. It's been used in a pejorative way. They're snowflakes, they're entitled, they're self-absorbed, they're technology obsessed, they're any negative thing, and they're killing everything that we care about. So anything that we can blame, we tend to blame on millennials. And I argue that almost all of that critique is both unfortunate and wrong, and that actually the frame that they represent, the new way of thinking, the new Copernican way of thinking, is in fact a great improvement and will actually help us become more like Jesus. So the faster we can turn over the reins of leadership of the church to millennials, the better. Well, by New Copernicans, I would basically refer to spiritually oriented millennials. It comes from Copernicus, who was the lay astronomer who made the fundamental observation that we are sun-centered and not earth-centered. And that was actually confirmed by Isaac Newton about 150 years later. But we talk about that in the history of science as the Copernican revolution. And so since millennials don't like to be called millennials, they actually don't like to be labeled. Not that anyone really does. But when you're talking about a frame shift, you have to have some kind of label. And so I said, to emphasize this shifting frame, we'll call them the New Copernicans, people who actually see reality and relationships in a completely new frame. The book I'm working on is not so much about millennials as a cohort. In fact, it's not actually based on cohort research. But I'm arguing that millennials are carriers, not the causes, of this new way of thinking. And since culture is largely invisible, they are a very useful foil because we can see the direction of culture by paying attention to their attitudes and habits. It's as if they're the first person up on the surfboard. They didn't create the wave that they're riding, but you can tell the size and direction of the wave by watching them. I was working as the director of cultural engagement at the John Templeton Foundation, and as a social scientist, you know that the largest growing area in American religious life is among those people who are religiously unaffiliated, what social scientists call religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And so I wanted to study them. And so I was told by my bosses that I needed to get a baseline survey, and so I asked a very competent research firm out of Portland, Oregon, to do a baseline survey, and they said, you can't do it. And I was like, really? They said no, because they're asking all the wrong questions. You can't ask a 2D question of a 3D reality and expect to get a clear picture of the 3D reality. And so I realized then that we had to think completely different ways, and we needed to actually listen to millennials more and let them tell us what were the right questions to ask. I mean, the simple way to say it is, if I'm telling a story about a group of people, and the people who I'm telling the story about don't see themselves in the story I'm telling, or worse, it pisses them off, then maybe, just maybe, there's something really wrong with the story I'm telling. And that's actually the situation with millennials today. And what's tragic about it is that they actually have the answers we need. And yet they don't actually have a voice, and they feel put down, and they are not being afforded leadership. And so I'm the resident champion of millennials to basically tell my generation to get out of the way because they are the future of the church. And since I don't think any brand whether it's the Republican National Committee or the U.S. Olympic Committee or Applebee's or the Evangelical Church, can survive without having taken this generation seriously. The book is really for three people. I think it'd be really helpful for parents of millennial children. I have 3 millennial children, and they are often close to their parents, since about 40% of them are still living at home. But the parents are completely baffled about the way they think about careers, the way they think about relationships, the way they think about life, and the way they think about faith. And so this book will be enormous help to parents. It's also targeted to boomer pastors of large churches, people my age, who are recognizing that the church is aging and that increasingly they have fewer and fewer young people, and they don't really know how to engage them, and they know that this is a problem, and this book will give them some counsel in that regard. And it's mostly for the younger generational leaders that are emerging, to give them a voice. So most millennials have an intuitive or inchoate sense of what's wrong and their own insights, but they don't actually have words or language by which to understand their sensibility. So one of my goals is to empower them so that they can have a language by which they can frame reality for other people. Where do we start the conversation? I would think that there's a lot of emotion around this conversation, defensiveness by all sides, and when your sides are up, you're not going to listen well. So I would simply use the book as a foil, and I would have older generation read it and younger generations read it and say, let's have a conversation about whether any of this makes sense. For most of the older generation, my book is probably going to be a bridge too far. That is, they'll think, oh my, and they won't be able to get it. But when they see the younger generation read the book and say, oh my word, this gives me faith in faith again and calls me back to the church, they will understand that this conversation itself could be an on-ramp for effective spiritual pilgrimage.